In this chapter, you're going to learn about the Japanese administration and the history of the Northern Mariana Islands. This is chapter 10 of The History of the Northern Mariana Islands by Don Farrell. So before we talk about the Japanese administration, we need to get some historical context. Back in 1952, the Portuguese arrived in Japan. This led to the introduction of Catholicism and the arrival of Catholic missionaries to convert the Japanese to Catholicism. This was during the Tokugawa period in the early 1600s in Japan. And also during this time, Japan saw more and more of an influence of people going to Japan, and they started to feel the need to reduce the influence from the Western world. Therefore, Japan started a state called Sakoku, which was seclusion of Japan from the rest of the world. This lasted until 1853 with the Convention of Kanagawa. This is when Japan signed the Treaty of Amity and Commerce. This was in, started by U.S. Commodore Matthew C. Perry, who traveled to Japan and was able to convince the Japanese government to reopen its ports for trade. This then led to Japan becoming more and more interested in becoming a successful maritime nation. In doing so, they built up its maritime and naval forces and started to uh, colonize and take over nearby Pacific islands. The Japanese actually looked into colonizing the Mariana Islands for expansion as early as 1876, but this is during the Spanish administration, and this was kind of a touchy time because America took over Guam, and also Germany bought the NMI from Spain in 1899. So Japan was kind of hesitant in looking into colonize in the Mariana Islands. But eventually, they didn't colonize, but they did uh, have some influence in Saipan during the German administration. Actually, it's towards the end of the Spanish administration transition to German administration. A Japanese company was established on Saipan. It was called the Heiki Company. And this company started to open small stores and farming activities on Saipan that exported to Japan, but it was a very small operation. And during this time, not only did the Japanese company Heike Company export copra and other island products, but they also brought in commodities and farming supplies from Japan. But again, this is during the transitional time from the Spanish to German administration. More and more Japanese companies became interested in investing in Saipan. Heike Company actually merged with another large company that was on. They formed the NBK Company, and this helped increase trading between Saipan and Japan during the German administration. Again, the Japanese just had business transactions. They did not have any governmental influence because this was a German administration. But that started to change when Japan started to set its eye on acquiring uh, the Marianas and other islands in the Pacific. So Japan formed an alliance with Great Britain in 1902. This is during the time when, during World War One, and Britain wanted to increase its influence in Asia to impede Russia from expanding further into the Pacific. Um, Germany at this time also was isolated because it was embroiled in World War One, so it was weak. The country was weak, and it was really difficult for that country to defend itself. Now, here's the thing: this is where Japan becomes kind of sneaky because Japan's supposed to provide naval assistance to Britain, and Japan promised to not annex any of the German colonies in Micronesia and China, but Japan always had other things in mind. So when Germany was most vulnerable, Japan decided to declare war on Germany and captured its German held colonies in Micronesia with taking Saipan on October 14, thus ending the German administration because the Germans surrendered, and it started the Japanese administration. So, at the beginning of the Japanese administration, we had this transitional time from German to Japanese. The Japanese government decided not to totally change the German laws. They decided to just continue to enforce the German laws with the local people, except for laws that were prejudicial to the Japanese order. So during this transitional time, it was easy for the people to acclimate and for the Japanese to, you know, come in and take over because the rules were set and they just had to do some tweaking. So by late 1914, Micronesia became one of 6 naval districts for Japan with their office in Saipan. So Saipan became a strategic place in terms of its naval force. By 1915, Japan began to invest more into Micronesia, looking into what it can do agriculturally, the health status of the islands and the people, and what kind of natural resources were available to the Japanese in its newly acquired colonies. So here's the interesting thing about the Japanese. They actually didn't, enslave the local people. They didn't, push them into poverty. It was very interesting because they provided kind of like modern services, public services for the local people. Education was a priority for the local people, but this was actually a very clever way by giving public education to the local people. And I'll explain more about that later. Um, the Japanese used the educational system to indoctrinate the locals, to be more accustomed to the Japanese language and custom. Healthcare at the beginning of the Japanese administration was very important so that diseases weren't spread to the immigrant Japanese workers. The Japanese always had, their health in mind, and they weren't necessarily aware of what diseases plague the people of the Marianas. Also, during this time, the islanders, as I mentioned, the transition was easy for the Japanese, but the transition was also easy for the islanders because the uh, laws were pretty much the same, and they were provided new services. So as they didn't have any new rights, but it was at least the same kind of order that was established previously by the Germans. In May 1919, the Supreme Council of the Allied Powers uh, agreed to give Japan official mandate over Micronesia. Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations officially gave that rule to Japan over its colonies in Micronesia. So after that, Japan started to enforce more of its own social order in the Marianas. By 1922, Japan implemented the Sonrikite, which is kind of like its hierarchy in terms of um, officials. The 3 levels. The first is the district head, the kucho, the village head, the sancho, and the assistant official, the joyaku. So these are people. By the way, these are local people. Okay, these are locals, indigenous people, Chamorros and Carolinians that were used um, to help the Japanese in collecting taxes, gathering statistics, and making reports. And these local people, they didn't have any authority to make rules, but they could report crimes to the Japanese police, and they could help with getting information and stuff like that. The local people were not resistant to the increased Japanese control because the Japanese actually did a lot of good things. For example, the Japanese had banned slave trade and arms trafficking, so we didn't have any issues in terms of illegal firearms. Um, the local people were not forced to work unless it's for a public project for the better good. For example, if they're when they built the hospital, the workers had to, or the locals had to work build the hospital, but they were compensated. So they're it's not necessarily slavery. And the Japanese also banned the consumption of liquor, but the locals, I guess, anywhere, same with America, if there's a prohibition on alcohol, people will find a way to get to it. So the locals still made tuba and agi, which are local forms of alcohol. Um, During the this time of the Japanese administration, Catholicism somewhat suffered. During the Spanish and German administration, the primary or the dominant religion was Catholicism, and we had priests in the Marianas, practicing. Basically, every local person was Catholic. Um, but then the Japanese started to hinder that because they kicked out all of the Spanish and German priests, and in their schools they started to introduce to the local people Hinduism, Shintoism, and Tenrikyo. So these are the types of religions that are practiced in Japan. However, the majority of the local people remain devout to Catholicism. I guess it's because that's it's part of their values that's been instilled already for a long time. For example, Cristo Rey, the Cristo Rey Church was renovated, and imagine Cristo Rey is that old, down over there in Garapan. They had a wooden bell tower, and the local people decided to replace that with a masonry one. And I guess you could attribute to the locals' increase in trade skill because of the Japanese. In terms of public education, as I mentioned earlier, the Japanese uh, decided to form a system, a public education system for the local people. All Chamorros and Carolinians had to attend at least 3 years of primary education. So imagine they had to go to school, right? I mean, it's just 3 years. But then during these 3 years, the students had to learn the Japanese language, and they're also taught arithmetic, so it's math, geography, agriculture, gymnastics, which is interesting to know. So they had some sort of PE and handicrafts. And certain special students could attend school for an additional 2 years. And it's very, cool that the Japanese wanted to educate the people, the local people. The Japanese students, because they're also children, Japanese children on Saipan, um, they went to school as well, but they're segregated from the Islander students. Instead of taking the 3 years of basic education, they took 8 years. So the Japanese children had a more formal education. And this difference in education and curriculum, so you might be thinking, why is it 3 years for the locals? Why is it 8 years for the Japanese? It's because the curriculum for the Islander students was designed to produce servants and skilled workers and minor officials, like the three levels of officials that I mentioned earlier, um, who understood English. So it's basically for to train the local people to be laborers. So it's not necessarily to advance them in the social chain. In terms of healthcare, in 1952, all indigenous people and Japanese civilians in the Marianas or in Micronesia were given free medication by naval officials. This is to help again with the prevention of the spread of disease. By 1922, the first government hospital was established, and compulsory vaccinations were given. So just like today, we're required to give vaccinations to young children. The people of the Marianas were mandated to get their vaccinations as well. Um, but here's the funny thing: the local people were charged only one-fourth of the rates paid the Japanese. So it's like the local people had local discount at the hospital, which is kind of funny. Um, let's see, the hospital also had relatively modern tech. There was X-ray equipment, for example, so it wasn't necessarily primitive. It was somewhat modern, which is really,
good for